Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and today we're bringing you part 3 in a 5-part adaptation of The Crooked Man, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes has been hired to investigate the apparent murder of Colonel Barclay, the decorated commanding officer of the Royal Mallows, a British Army regiment. Colonel Barclay died in his own home in the company of his wife Nancy after a fierce argument between them. Servants heard her yelling the name David, followed by terrible screams from the colonel. When the room was investigated, the colonel was found dead from an awful head injury, and Nancy had lapsed into unconsciousness, apparently from shock. Nancy Barclay is now the prime suspect in her husband's death, despite the carved wooden club found upon the floor. As we rejoin the story in part 3, Sherlock Holmes brings his detailed explanation of the scene of the crime to his friend Dr. Watson to a close, as the two friends prepare to tackle the final stages of their investigation at the regimental headquarters of the Royal Mallows at Aldershot. I listened with rapt attention as my friend brought his account of his investigation up to that point to a close. There could be no question that the most distinctive and suggestive point in the case was the singular disappearance of the door key from the crime scene. A most careful search had failed to discover it in the room where Colonel Barclay had been killed. Therefore, it must have been taken from it. But neither the colonel nor the colonel's wife could have taken it. That was perfectly clear. Therefore, a third person must have entered the room, and that third person could have only come in through the French window. It seemed to Holmes that a careful examination of the room and the lawn might possibly reveal some traces of this mysterious individual. I know all of the methods of my dear friend Sherlock Holmes, and there was not one of them which he did not apply to the inquiry. And it ended with him discovering traces in the room, yes, but very different ones from those which he had expected. Again, Holmes stared across the drawing room table at me with fire-bright eyes. He spoke to me urgently, as one in the confessional.
There had been a man in the room, and he had crossed the lawn coming from the road. I was able to obtain 5 very clear impressions of his footmarks. 1 in the roadway itself at the point where he had climbed the low wall, 2 in the lawn, and 2 very faint ones upon the stained boards near the window where he had entered. He had apparently rushed across the lawn, for his toe marks were much deeper than his heels, but it was not the man who surprised me. It was his companion.
His companion? Holmes pulled a large sheet of tissue paper out of his pocket and carefully unfolded it upon his knee.
What do you make of that?
The paper was covered over with the tracings of the footmarks of some small animal. It had 5 well-marked footpads, an indication of long nails, and the whole print might be nearly as large as a dessert spoon. It's a dog.
Did you ever hear of a dog running up a curtain? I found distinct traces that this creature had done so.
A monkey, then?
But it is not the print of a monkey.
What can it be, then?
Neither dog, nor cat, nor monkey, nor any creature that we are familiar with. I have tried to reconstruct it from the measurements. Here are 4 prints where the beast has been standing motionless. You see that it is no less than 15 inches from forefoot to hind. Add to that the length of neck and head, and you get a creature not much less than 2 feet long, probably more if there is any tail. But now observe this other measurement. The animal has been moving, and we have the length of its stride. In each case, it is about 3 inches. You have an indication, you see, of a long body with very short legs attached to it. It has not been considerate enough to leave any of its hair behind, but its general shape must be what I've indicated, and it can run up a curtain, and it is carnivorous.
How do you deduce that?
Well, because it ran up the curtain. A canary's cage was hanging in the window, and its aim seems to have been to get at the bird.
Then what was this beast?
If I could give it a name, it might go a long way towards solving the case. On the whole, it was probably some creature of the weasel and stoat tribe, and yet it is larger than any of these that I have seen.
But what had it to do with the crime?
That also is still obscure. But we have learned a good deal, you perceive. We know that a man stood in the road looking at the quarrel between the Barclays. The blinds were up and the room lighted. We know also that he ran across the lawn, entered the room accompanied by a strange animal, and that he either struck the colonel or, as is equally possible, that the colonel fell down from sheer fright at the sight of him and cut his head on the corner of the fender. Finally, we have the curious fact that the intruder carried away the key with him when he left.
Your discoveries seem to have left the business more obscure than it was before.
Quite so. They undoubtedly showed that the affair was much deeper than was at first conjectured. I thought the matter over, and I came to the conclusion that I must approach the case from another aspect. But really, Watson, I'm keeping you up, and I might just as well tell you all of this on our way to Aldershot tomorrow.
Thank you. You have gone rather too far to stop, I think.
It is quite certain that when Mrs. Barclay left the house at 7:30, she was on good terms with her husband. She was never, as I think I have said, ostentatiously affectionate. But she was heard by the coachman chatting with the colonel in a friendly fashion. Now, it is equally certain that immediately at her return, she had gone to the room in which she was least likely to see her husband, and finally, on his coming into her, had broken into a violent argument. Therefore, something had occurred between 7:30 and 9 o'clock which had completely altered her feelings towards him. But Miss Morrison had been with her during the whole of that hour and a half. It was absolutely certain, therefore, in spite of her denial, that she must know something of the matter.
Holmes's first conjecture was that possibly there had been some marital infidelity between this young lady and the old soldier, which the former had now confessed to his wife. That would account for her angry reaction, and also for the girl's denial that anything had occurred. Nor would it be entirely incompatible with most of the words overheard. But there was that reference to David, and there was the known affection of the colonel for his wife to weigh against it, to say nothing of the tragic intrusion of this other man, which might of course be entirely disconnected from which had gone before. It was not easy to pick one's steps, but on the whole, Holmes was inclined to dismiss the idea that there had been anything between the colonel and Miss Morrison, but more than ever convinced that the young lady held the clue as to what it was which had turned Mrs. Barclay to hatred of her husband. Holmes took the obvious course, therefore, of calling directly upon Miss Morrison, the circumstances of which meeting he felt obliged to tell me. The circumstances of Colonel Barclay's death have become even more uncertain with the revelation that Sherlock Holmes has found the footprints of a mysterious creature in the room where the bloody death occurred. Watson has agreed to accompany his friend Sherlock Holmes down to Aldershot for the final stages of their investigation, but not before the detective recounts to him the testimony of the young Miss Morrison, a friend of the Colonel's wife, Nancy Barclay, and a fellow worker in the Christian charities with which she was associated, who oversaw a very interesting interaction between Nancy and a mysterious man on the eve of her husband's apparent murder. Join us again tomorrow evening to hear her testimony in part 4 of The Crooked Man here on BeFM Drama.